Scott R. Ferris is an American writer and historian and the author of Rockwell, Kent's Forgotten Landscapes and The View from Asgard, Rockwell, Kent's Adirondack Legacy. He's also the curator of an exhibition entitled Origins, the Development of an Artist and His Craft, which is currently showing at the Rockwell Kent Gallery on the SUNY Plattsburgh campus. It runs through to August 11th, 2023. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
We're going to be talking about Rockwell Kent, and he was an American graphic designer, painter, printmaker, book and advertising illustrator, writer, sailor, and adventurer. Does that cover it?
Close. Not quite, but close. He was quite an active man. Wore many hats.
Yes, he traveled to all over the place, but he seemed to love the cold north climate.
Well, he was inspired by going to Monhegan Island, Maine in his early years. That island surely is subject to cold, windy winters and breezy summers. He went from there up to Alaska for a winter stay, coincidentally. And that was 1918, 1919. He had been in Newfoundland before that in 1910, and then he went back in 1914 and 15. So yeah, those are cold climes, but then he makes it even more adventurous by going to Tierra del Fuego, on the opposite end of the world, known for its rough weather. Ends up in Greenland in 1929 to 35 with 3 different trips. Those were wintertime trips as well.
And these are all painting trips. Like he's out there in the plein air actually painting?
Exactly. No matter where he's going, he's not just painting, but he's drawing, he's writing, creating these diaries that become travel logs and quite popular books. When he's painting the landscape in a realist and more stylized method of painting. And he is also creating imagery, drawings, prints that he can put into book form. So the combination of the illustrations and the writings, they become books themselves. They also become magazine articles that lead to books, or they're independent. So he's using everything available to him to express himself and to share that with others.
Yeah, he was just prodigious. He must have had incredible energy and drive.
Indeed. He, I don't know how he slept, really, because he was active before the sun rose to sunset, and then it was time to party all night. So, yeah, he didn't sleep very much, I don't think.
Now, we have just looked through a selection of books and magazines and advertisements that he designed over the years. We started off talking about, did he go to Columbia University?
He went to, I think in those days they called it the Columbia College of Architecture, which is where he went. His father died when he was 5 years old. He had a younger sister who didn't even know the father because she was born after he died. The mother was not really destitute, but a little turmoil. And so
what do you mean by turmoil?
She was kind of riding both sides of the tracks. She lived the good life of living with a rich aunt and uncle, and being somewhat impoverished because she didn't have money of her own to control her own and her family's life.
You know who that reminds me of? It's Randolph Hearst. His mom controlled the purse strings for the longest time.
Ah, okay.
But
So what happened was that his mother, Kent wanted to paint, and he had studied with William Merritt Chase in Shinnecock on Long Island for a little bit. That whet his appetite, and so he wanted to paint. His mother said, "I don't think so. We don't have the money to afford. We need a man in the house to take care of things, and so you need to find a paying job. So architecture, that works for me." So Kent went to Columbia to study architecture. So that's a roundabout way of answering your question, but that's how he gets into Columbia, and how he does study architecture, which becomes useful for him in many ways. One of which, of course, is that he knows how a building is put together, and through his life he builds innumerable houses for himself and others, whether it's on Monhegan, whether it's in Au Sable Forks, New York, wherever he lived, he would either restructure a house or add to it, like the house in Newfoundland, which needed some work on it. And then, so that's one aspect. The other is that he made a living as an architectural rendering in the early years, and joined forces with some local friends from the Tarrytown, New York area, where they all grew up. Their family lives. The Ewing family, the Chapel family, and then the third venue that I was going down, there was the actual building, the rendering, and I forget at the moment. But that all stemmed out of the years from Tarrytown, basically, and going to Columbia and
Okay.
all of that.
Now, you showed me some drawings that he'd done for the Columbia Jester magazine right around 1900.
Right. Yeah, when he was a student there, the copies that I have of that publication, they date from 1901 to 1906, which goes beyond the years when he actually studied there. By 1906, he gets his wish, and he gets to study painting with Robert Henry, Kenneth Hayes Miller. He's already studied with Abbott Thayer.
Where did he do that?
In New York. With Abbott Thayer, he was in New Hampshire, but with Robert Henry and Kenneth Hayes Miller, he was in New York, and it was known as the New York School. And William Merritt Chase had his hand in it at that time as well.
Okay.
But it was Robert Henry who was the leading instructor for most of the noted American art painters of that time period, including Edward Hopper and George Bellows.
Okay, so we then looked at Blue Mouse and White Elephant. What's that?
Those were kind of a young man's. He and I think it was Blaine Ewing, a friend of his from the Tarrytown area, who got together and decided they would write this book for family use.
Just sort of the use of the collective families.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't made for publication. That wasn't anything that was in their mind per se at the time. It was just a fun thing to do. It kind of branches out into his later satirical work, where he's poking fun at family and friends and society in general.
Yeah, he does these sweet little capital letters with animals sort of worked into them. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of them that we reviewed was, it showed the white elephant, and when that paragraph starts, it starts with the two words white elephant, but the W is capitalized, and it's in the form of the elephant's head.
Yes.
And he uses that technique, that style, that motif, if you will, in later years for a number of books that he illustrates.
Okay, and then he gets into more mainstream magazines. Do you know how that happened? He was pretty sociable, right?
Oh, he was very outgoing. His first published illustrations came out in the New York Evening Call, which was a socio-political publication. of the time period, the late part of the first decade. And then come the teens, he and George Chappell, again from the Tarrytown days, who also, under Ewing and Chappell, the architectural firm, had hired Kent as a renderer. He and George Chappell get together to Kent illustrates and Chappell writes satirical prose, starting with publications such as the original Life magazine, Puck, Judge, Vanity Fair, the New York Herald Tribune. So at that point, they're selling their product, and they're successful at it. But in part, that's seeds or the origins to getting involved in meeting publishers for magazines and books. And so his work really blossoms come 1920, when all of this comes to a head, where he's not only continuing to do these satirical commissions, but he's also traveled to Alaska. He writes a book about it from his diary. He illustrates it with drawings he did when he was there. So he becomes a travel writer and illustrator now of renown, which leads almost immediately to publications like Scribner's Magazine, Adventure Magazine.
He did the covers, didn't he?
He did the covers for Scribner's Magazine for a couple of years. He did covers and internal illustrations for various stories within Adventure Magazine. But virtually any magazine of that ilk of the day, he's involved in it. And one of the other early magazines that he works in that has a title for a later magazine of a different sort is Playboy.
Yes, I took a great, it's just so striking, that cover, isn't it? The covers on those.
And those publications, you could actually find actual woodcuts or wood engravings within them that were tipped in. Egmont Ahrens was the publisher of those, and it's art of the day. It's American modernism. It's world modernism, really. When you look at the roster list of artists that are represented, not just as fine artists, but as authors. Anybody and everybody that now we take for granted as being top of the list, they're in there.
Well, there's a beautiful photograph of Ezra Pound in one of those Playboys.
Yeah.
Incidentally, that noise kicking in there is the furnace in this lovely old house that you have just outside of Boonville, New York, where we're currently located. And earlier, if you did hear anything, that was this cat. It's a gigantic cat scratching something. Hopefully not furniture. Okay, so that's a pretty good way for him then, with these magazine illustrations, to get his name known pretty quickly within the whole publishing industry, isn't it?
Oh, sure. You name anybody and everybody who was themselves starting out as publishers.
Yeah.
How they came to the fore. You take Random House, you take Bonai Books, you take Viking Press. He also did the logos for Viking, for Random House.
Well, you did show me, too. It jumps ahead a bit, but the very first book that Random House publishes.
Exactly. Candide,
and he's prominent as the illustrator, and actually he signs copies of it, doesn't he?
Oh yeah, that was part of the shtick, if you will, that these publishers were very interested in not only producing books, but producing high quality material.
Yeah.
But they were not adverse to publishing trade editions as well, which would maximize both the artists, the authors, and the publishing house profit.
Right. I mean, appealing to all the different levels of the market.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this was in a day when books were really cherished, and collectors were looking for these limited editions,
Yeah.
and Kent obliged them.
The other point that you raise is that in that very first book, I think we were looking at the title page, or maybe it's the colophon. And at the bottom of the page, there's the Random House, the
Yes.
houses.
Yes.
It's actually on a strip of water
Yep.
at the bottom of that page, and he designed that logo.
Exactly. That was for Voltaire's Candide. And so in the colophon, he's expanded his original drawing for the logo to make it more decorative, which actually follows suit with illustrations within the book itself, especially the title page, which is a lot more elaborate than the internal illustrations. Yes, he was very good at providing everything that a publisher would need, from logos to writings to illustrations to graphic design to typeface. He partook in it all.
It's interesting too how many of the publishers did put out their own magazines. I was just mentioning the one that Bonai published right around this same period of we've jumped ahead a bit, but right around 1930, late 20s, early 30s. And this seems to be a particularly fecund time for him, too. He's just so... I mean, we've got a stack of his books from those years. They come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and designs, don't they?
Oh, indeed. And books like Wilderness, they're already into a second printing within 3 months of it being published.
That was his book on
his book of his trip to Alaska.
Right.
When within the following year or two, they're into the second and third editions, and then you look at again the Candide book. The limited edition was hand-colored watercolors. Then they had the trade edition that wasn't quite as elaborate, but those come out virtually immediately. You name the book, and at that time period, and there is a limited edition, there is a trade edition, but some of them even started with magazine stories.
Yes.
So like Kent's second book that he created from his diary and from drawings that he made when he was in Tierra del Fuego. That book came out shortly after Wilderness. This one came out in 22, and they're repeating their success story. It's not just the writing, the illustrations, the sales of the book and its various editions, but it's in concert using the same method. There was an exhibition of Kent's drawings in New York, and then the exhibition of the paintings the following year, which is when the book is launched. He did the same thing in 22 when he had the trip to Tierra del Fuego, and they're having a drawing and a painting exhibition. And so that's where he gains a lot of attention, so much so that he ends up doing these illustrations, like I said earlier, not just the covers, but the internal illustrations for magazines, for the Tierra del Fuego book, Voyaging. It starts out as Stories in Century magazine, so there's some alteration to the writing when it comes into book form, but he's doing the initial published writing there. Same with his book Salamina, which comes in the 30s, and the story begins in 3 summer editions of Esquire magazine. So it's the publishers are wise to the marketing. Kent's wise to what's going on, so he's capitalizing, they're capitalizing, and the public is rewarded with some different illustrations, maybe a slightly different storyline, not in a factual sense, but the way that he's presenting his story. So it's expanding on one idea, and it just carries on in a variety of venues.
Well, certainly these writers from the 20s made enormous money from selling their stories into magazines, didn't they?
Sure. Kent, he did well for himself. He was a Debsian socialist right at the get-go back in 1904.
What do you mean, Debsian socialist?
Well, Eugene V. Debs, the preeminent...
Victor. Is it Victor?
Victor.
Yeah.
Eugene V. Victor Debs.
Yeah.
Even since the late 1800s, he was out there fighting for the unions and running for president and getting thrown in jail because the U.S. government didn't like him being an American. So,
was he the head of the Communist Party of America or no? Or is it?
No, he was a socialist.
Yeah,
and
but so they wouldn't. I mean, that just wouldn't be.
They're not swimming in the same pools.
No. Okay.
A lot of people associate one with the other, but they're. If you ever listen to Kent's interview with John Wingate in the 1950s, a radio interview, Wingate says something about him being called a communist and being held before the McCarthy committee and all this, and Kent fires back, "I'm not a communist. I don't know much about them, but I wouldn't want to be a communist." And
it's such bullshit, isn't it? The use of the language, this fear-mongering that by introducing social measures that help people.
Exactly.
You're going to get a freaking dictator with the package. It's bullshit.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Kent, he argued against that, and he lived against it. People say, well, you made so much money in your career, how could you be a socialist? Well, why are we comparing oranges and apples? It's the same old story. Philosophy and work ethic and belief in human beings and feeling for human beings. How does that come into this story? It's a personal story and how you interpret it. And Kent, I'm thinking that his one brief writing was "What is an American?" And so he goes on. It's a small publication. But I think at the very end of that he says, if that's communism, then I'm a communist. And he is not admitting to being a communist. He's telling the public that pretty much the same thing that he told John Wingate in the 50s, is that here's your term, chew on it.
Yeah. He did a lot of work for various socialist publications, didn't he? The Masses, for one.
Sure. Well, the New Masses
is
what he was engaged in. He did a lot of covers for them. He did a number of stories for them, or interviews as well. A lot of the publications that he did illustrative work for were for labor groups, the IWO, the International Workers Organization, the ILWU, the International Longshoremen's and Workmen's Warehousemen's Union. He was present and president in some cases of a lot of these unions. And in his 1940 book, This Is My Own, he writes almost a full page listing some of the organizations that he belongs to, and it's something like 58 or 68 organizations, and he said that I did so little I'm ashamed of myself, or I'm paraphrasing here, but it's unbelievable the work that he did, the number of engagements he was involved in. So he was endlessly active.
He must have known Paul Robeson then.
Oh, he did know
singer.
Paul from the ILWU, from IWO. They were mate in the labor field. In the 1950s, Paul Robeson had gone to the Soviet Union to perform on a number of occasions.
Mm-hmm. Now he sings some beautiful Russian folk songs, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
He was stopped from going in the 50s the same way that Kent was stopped from going abroad in the 50s, and how
they had their passports yanked.
Yes, they had their passports yanked. Picasso couldn't come to the States for similar reasons, and so being the dogged individual that Kent was, he fought it. He fought the State Department, and it was a lengthy court battle. It started at about 1950, because he had gone to the World Congress for Peace in 1949 and again in 50, and then the U.S. State Department said, "We're putting the brakes on that. We're holding you back from traveling abroad." And so what ended up, after about 8 years of court battles, which ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court, it became known as the right to travel case. And it was the Kent Briel, B-R-I-E-H-L case. Dr. Briel out of California. They were kind of the lead sources in this case. Mm-hmm. And in June of 1958, they finally won in the Supreme Court by one justice. And so Kent and his third wife, Sally, said, now's our chance to get out of town before any appeal comes up. And so by July, they're off to the Soviet Union, where there is a exhibition of Kent's work going on in 5 cities in the Soviet Union. And they made it in time to catch the tail end of the exhibit. But that's a story in its own, and that gets back to your mentioning my book, Rockwell, Kent's Forgotten Landscapes, which is a catalog of the collection that went to the Soviet Union, the collection of Kent's own personal holdings of his artwork.
And it's still in the Soviet Union, or Russia now?
Well, the bulk of it is in Russia.
Where? In the Hermitage? Or?
The majority of the work, there were about 28 paintings and hundreds of drawings, prints, manuscripts and such that made it to the Pushkin. And then the second largest holder of the paintings is the Hermitage, and they have, I think, 26 paintings and only maybe 5 drawings.
Okay.
Because the Soviet Union was much broader than it is today, Armenia was under their umbrella at the time, and so artwork ended up at the National Gallery of Armenia and the Diligent Regional Museum. Artwork is also in Kyiv and Odessa, and hopefully it's not going to get blown up. So when the country broke up, then the artwork stayed in the museums instead of pulling it back all into Russia again.
Just getting back to how the publishers maximized their revenues from the texts and the illustrations of that text. We talked about the fact that they showed up in magazines typically to start with, and then all these whole variety of different editions. And nothing illustrates that as well as Moby Dick, which is probably what he's best known for, is illustrating the Moby Dick.
Sure. No, and it's true today. And they still run new editions of the book with Kent illustrations. I don't know how many editions are out there now, but
You showed me a whole stack of them, though, didn't you?
Yes.
Riverside started off, right?
No, Lakeside Press.
Lakeside, sorry, yes.
R. Donnelly and Son out of Chicago.
Yeah.
They were another outfit that decided to get into the book printing industry. This was their maiden voyage, and they actually had a big promotional campaign, about 4 books at the time. Thoreau's Walden was one of them.
Poe was another thing.
Poe's Tales was another, to something before the mast. That was the fourth one. And they created these exhibitions, not just in Chicago, but they could travel, of Kent's drawings. They did an exhibit in Chicago at the galleries at Donnelly at Lakeside Press. The Vi Gallery in New York did an exhibition of Kent's drawings at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think they preceded Donnelly's show. They also did publications related to these books, large format, small
related
format.
to the exhibitions. Yeah.
Related to these four books in particular, and the various promotional materials. And they're just single-fold leaflets, or they're actual multi-paged booklets that they produce, as they're espousing on the qualities of these books.
Mm-hmm.
They're in some of the leaflets, they're even giving you the sizes of the pages and the font and what kind of font and who did this and that.
Yes, in fact, we've got this book here that was published on those, that experience of publishing those four books. It's called American Culture in the Marketplace. And what's interesting is that the word that he uses to describe Moby Dick is homey. He wants the typeface to reflect that, but he didn't want to go with engravings. He wanted to go with woodcuts because it'd be precisely that.
That's somewhat of a misnomer in the sense that in some of the promotional materials for Kent's early illustrations, he is such a black and white artist. His work is stark, it's sharp, and so when Kent is working in brush, pen, and ink, mm-hmm. Oftentimes it comes off as woodcuts and sometimes wood engravings. But you'll see that in all of the early reviews. You'll see that today. People make the mistake and they say, with woodcuts by Rockwell Kent. In the 3-volume Moby Dick set, the frontispiece, they are engravings. But the drawings within are brush, pen, and ink.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find that passage where they quote him.
But yes, you're right there. He referred to it as homey.
Homey rather than refined and elegant.
Yes.
And then it looks like they're quoting him here. The dominant characteristic of the Melville's book, he believed, the character of the type for the text also should be homey rather than refined and elegant. Homey and rich, one does, to be sure, associate starkness and coldness, as you have with the theme of the sea, but Moby Dick is decidedly not of that character. Its prose is ample, voluminous, rich, warm. It, above all, is not refined, not studied. It blunders through to triumphant success by the dramatic intensity of the visionary mind it serves. It is this is Kent himself. It is a literary woodcutting, though. Yes, yeah. It is a literary woodcutting, not engraving. Certainly, as far as my own work is concerned, Caslon is more suitable than Bodoni. The color, so far as I can see, is determined. Night, the midnight darkness enveloping human existence, the darkness of the human soul, the abyss, such is the mood of Moby Dick.
Yes, indeed. And that's typical of some of the work that he's doing at that time period. If you look at the wood engravings that he did for American Car and Foundry, right from the late 20s into the early 30s.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. His blacks are just unbelievable. When he's getting the wood engravings printed by a professional printer, they're talking about papers. What kind of paper is going to hold that ink so that you get the even black across the board? Mm. And you look at the wood engraving, the Lovers, where there's so much black, but it's highlighted by his sense of light off of the figures. it's just it's amazing, and that he and a printer, in the case of the Lovers, that they could pull that off. It's their understanding of the materials,
Yeah.
and from the paper to the inks to how Kent is working the artwork.
Well, it seems that to me, anyway, that is a theme in his work is the dark night sky with stars in it. You see a lot of that, and you also see a lot of heads turned up, facing the heavens, and reaching for the heavens.
Right, it's the great beyond. It's something greater than ourselves that Kent was connected to. And that's very true. You look at the earliest of his work to the latest of his work, and the sky is the symbol, the mountain is the symbol for what we are not, and what we can only try to attain during our lifetimes.
What's that?
And that is the ultimate experience. What is life? Let's get engaged in the beyond. We're just simple.
How do you do that?
How do you do that?
How did he do that?
In a strong spiritual belief in something beyond himself. He could only strive to be what he was physically and intellectually capable of, but he realized that there was something beyond that. So where do you find that? You find that in the darkness of the starlit skies. You find it by looking to the heavens, but you experience it by being one of those whalers in Moby Dick, or you are being, in Kent's actual life, one of the lobstermen on Monhegan Island, going out there in the oil-stiff garments, fighting the cold temperatures to harvest lobsters. He was at heart a socialist who dreamed well for himself and was extremely successful, and realized that on his tour up in life that he could bring others with them, or he could help others along the way. That's what his socialism was all about, his Debsian socialism.
It is interesting, isn't it? His work with books and magazines and advertising. I mean, it's not something you do typically associate with someone who's out in the wilderness and an adventurer. It's interesting how he's combined those two.
Well, life for him was an adventure that he was going to live to the fullest, and he tells us that. Yeah. I'm going to live life to the fullest.
And exactly how did he do that then?
He did that by doing an astronomical amount of work. I mean, if you look at any given year, say in the 1930s, and you look at the magazines he's writing and illustrating for, the books he's writing and illustrating, the trips to Greenland that he's taking, the running of his Asgard farm in Sable Forks, New York. He's just constantly on the go, doing everything. How can you create an endless body of work in 1 year if you're sleeping at some point?
Right.
It's just just amazing.
Yeah, just going back to him sort of making it, I don't say big, but he suddenly, lots of people become aware of him and want to retain his services for a lot of different aspects of who he is and what he does.
Sure.
You mentioned the Nodler Gallery. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Well, Nodler was a preeminent gallery of American, but art in general.
Nodler or Nodler?
I call it Nodler. I believe that's how they pronounce it. They were active in the business for decades. In fact, they didn't, I believe they were the ones that that fell out in recent years for financial issues. But they were a prominent gallery at the time, had quite a following. Kent got involved with them. His exhibition of Alaska drawings in 1919 and Alaska paintings in 1920. They were very good at promoting his work, and obviously it was the kickoff point for his broader artistic career. But anybody who knows anything about art history and exhibitions out of New York will be familiar with the name.
So he basically, after these huge successes with Moby Dick and Candide and others, Canterbury Tales, he just sort of continues just working away and illustrating books and magazines.
Yes, and at the same time that he's running a farm and he's painting and he's doing exhibitions, and to supplement his income during rougher times, he is literally barnstorming across the country, giving lectures. Lee Colston, I think, was the name of one lecture organizer that sends him on the road. So he's hitting city after city, night after night, barnstorming.
What's he talking about?
He's talking about, well, his travels for one, for the time period. He's using tinted, painted glass slides of the photographs he took when he was in Greenland. Many of those are still intact. They're at the Plattsburgh State Art Museum. He is talking about topics that are specific to the group he's speaking with, whether it's a labor union or whatever the case may be. So all of this, again, how do you do all of that stuff, a single person? Well, you have people helping to run the farm. You have a wife who also serves as a secretary. You have promising artists in the region who can come in to help you do coloring and Candide and the book illustrations. Some of the people became known in their own right, like Arto Monaco, who helped Kent do some work at Asgard, and then he ends up going out to California and working with some, I think it was some film industries and animation, and then he comes back to the Adirondacks again and opens up this little kiddie game area with little train lines running through it for kids, and he designed and created all these kid-sized buildings, a little wonderland, the North Country version of Disneyland. So this is how Kent, in part, accomplishes everything. But he is the source of the ideas and the direction and the networking and all that creates this. There was another guy in that area, Bill Calhoun, who lived just at the bottom of the hill. He was still alive when I worked at the Kent estate, and so I would visit with him often, and he got involved in things like the chapter had letters in his book, It's Me, O Lord. He also is a figure in my exhibition, Origins of the Evolution of an Artist and His Craft. That's at Plattsburgh State. Bill actually did a couple of cartoons poking fun at Kent. One of them is called This Is My Own, which is after Kent's book by that title. And another was about a Greenland monster. He envisioned that Kent had landed in Greenland and was facing this big monster. And so that cartoon is in the Origins exhibition at Plattsburgh.
So why have you spent your life really researching and collecting him? Why have you done that?
Well, it's kind of like the story of Kent being at the soon-to-be-opened Random House in New York, where he happened to be in the office of Bennett Cerf and others who said, well, we need a logo. So Kent, he just happened to be the man on the spot at the right time. Or you think of Friedolf Johnson, who was an artist in his own right, and he was a writer, and he happened to be in the offices at Knopf talking about a book, and they said, well, we're planning on doing a book on Rockwell Kent called Rockwell Kent, an anthology of his work. So Friedolf was there at the right time, so he signed on as editor for the book. And then, well, actually right around the same time, little Scott Ferris comes to Plattsburgh State to go to school for a semester, and he decides to take off to go to Europe for a year of study, and then when he comes back, the Kent collection at Plattsburgh is formally opened, and there's a new director there, and they have this massive collection of Kent's artwork that needs to be cataloged. And so, lo and behold, Scott Ferris just happens to be there at the right time and knows what to do, and so I get started at the Kent Gallery. I also did work at the Myers Fine Arts Gallery, which is now known as the Burke Gallery, installing exhibitions and such. And come 1980, in the spring, Sally Kent Gorton, or Sally Kent at the time, her second husband, John Gorton, he passes, and they're in the middle of doing this Kent anthology that I just mentioned, and they have gallery representation in New York at Hammer Galleries. There are copyright issues to deal with. There are a number of things at the Kent estate that need to be handled, and I had drawn up a chronology for the Kent Gallery of Kent's life, as well as doing the cataloging of the artwork. And so the new director showed that material to John and Sally, and then John passes, and then Sally says, well, what about that Scott Ferris? Can he do the job? And so Ed and his wife Bet take me to the estate, and I meet Sally, and so I sign on. When that tenure ended, people started, they knew that I worked for the legacies, and so they asked me about information related to things that they were selling. Christie's, Sotheby's, primarily. They were looking for catalog data for their sales. It was the old routine of, well, just think you will have your name out there, but no money. Your name. We're developing your name here, right?
Yes.
And so I got tired of doing that, and I said, all right, it's time to do a book. So I did Rockwell Kent's Forgotten Landscapes, which deals with, it's a catalog of the artwork that Kent gave to the Soviet Union in 1960, and things have flourished since then, in the sense that there are other publications, there are exhibitions, there's consulting.
Well, as you were saying, too, because you've developed your name in connection with him, whenever anyone's got any kind of question about him, or if they've got material that he produced, or you are a collector. We talked about this. If you are you an archivist? Are you a historian? Or are you a collector? I mean, they're all lumped in together. You won't write something unless you can see the original copy, right?
Right. I've always chosen to live somewhat remotely, and actually it doesn't matter where I live. The material that I need to do my writing, to curate an exhibition, to give a lecture, I want to go on that stage. I want to be printed with facts to the best of my knowledge. And where am I going to get that material if I'm not also a collector, as you say? So I obviously have put out more stuff than you even have time to take a peek at, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And the reason, as I say, for having this material is that I want to know what I'm talking about. I want to have the proof. I don't want to tell people that Kent's Moby Dick is filled with woodcuts that you'll love, when in fact they're drawings.
Yeah.
I've seen the drawings. I've seen Most of the 270 or how many drawings there are in Moby Dick, and I know what they are. I've seen
You've
images.
seen the originals.
Exactly.
That's an important word for you.
Exactly. Yeah. So in a sense, it gets back to this exhibition that I put together for Plattsburgh, and I want people to see how a woodcut of multicolors is produced. I want them to see how a study developed from little scratchings on a piece of scrap paper to a finished drawing, to its use in a magazine or a book or a painting, for that matter. And I want people to see that over time, Kent was always thinking about his work. If it was, say, if a painting was in his studio for years, one day he might say, well, I have another idea for that painting. And so he'll make alterations to that. If you don't know that he did those sorts of things, what do you know about his artwork? What do you know about the person?
Well, he wanted to utilize it in different ways, didn't he? He was there's a beautiful image of mountains and ocean and boats, very, very colorful, quite contrary to what you normally associate him with, which are these engravings and drawings in black and white.
Right. But that piece in itself it's black and white, and by that I mean that it's stark. He's using light brilliantly, and
but it's beautifully colored too, though.
Oh, it's beautifully colored for sure.
Yeah,
he did 2 paintings for that bank, and now it's Citibank, I believe, is now the owner of that company, and they have been for a number of years, and they still own the 2 paintings. One is of workers in Brazil, which is in stark contrast to the painting that you're referring to, which is this beautiful landscape from the point of being out in a ship. So you're looking across the bay toward this mountainous landscape and city. The light is just terrific in that painting. But he does it in other paintings too. A work like that for the bank, most of the commercial endeavors that he did, he referred to them as pot boilers. They were what kept him going. That paid for his livelihood. So little wonder that he did an endless body of work. He's more prolific than any other American artist that I can think of. He may even have surpassed Picasso for the amount of work that he created.
I wonder, is it a question of the American public's taste? And what I'm getting at is these sort of headers for chapters and these little tail at the end of the chapter. These are the types of things that he produced in his books in many cases, and yet you just don't see that anymore. But it was hugely popular in the 30s, and
oh, sure, and even earlier.
So why isn't it popular now? It just looks quaint now.
I couldn't give you a definitive answer, but in part, I think it's what we think of books today compared to what was considered about books back in the day is extremely different. But then we have the internet, and we have television, and we have radio, and back in those earlier days when the rich folk are buying up the limited editions, the common folk are buying up the trade editions, people are buying up the later editions of the same publication at a lesser cost. That was their means of being entertained,
looking at images,
and exploring the world beyond them through other people's travel, other people's ideas.
I suppose that's it. Is that there weren't that many outlets for people to have a look at this kind of artwork, if you will.
Sure.
Now we can see it anywhere we want, anytime we want, in beautiful colors.
We can, but we're seeing it, if you will, virtually. We're
Yeah.
not, as I showed you, some drawings for Wilderness, drawings for Salamina in the magazine form,
Mm.
drawing for the Playboy magazine. Until people see that actual artwork, where you see the brushstrokes, you see the pen markings, you see the type of paper that it's on, you see the composition that the artist created in real life. I mean, we're not looking at that today. For the most part, we're looking at it virtually.
Yeah.
So hail the artist that's still alive and creating this material. And we should appreciate that, and we should give ourselves the opportunity to go to an exhibition like Origins at Plattsburgh State and see how this work developed and see the final product. See the difference between a brushstroke and a offset lithograph.
Just winding down then, how did you specifically go about collecting everything that you have here, all the magazines, the prints, all the different types of books that you have? It's nice to have the focus, but what did you do? Or what do you do?
Well, I've always been a pauper, not in the true sense of someone who really is in need. I mean, I have a sizable house filled with this collection, if you will, but I did not, I may not have the finest of goods, but what I have is what I need to do the work that I do. And
How'd you get it?
I would struggle if I was making $120 a week, maybe gross. Maybe I would spend $10 or $30 and go without something till the following week, when you could buy tear sheets for magazines for $2, $4, to buy books for under $15, to buy artwork for $100 to $500. That didn't come to me till later, but
Where'd you find it?
all over the country, and gifts, loads of gifts. My father knew my interest. I would get a copy of Wilderness for my birthday, for instance. When I worked at the Kent Estate, Sally would give me gifts for my birthday or Christmas, a going-away gift. I have a drawing that its origins come from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, one of his full-page illustrations that he adapted to the cover of a 1950s Vanguard LP jacket. That came from Sally. A lot of my material came from Jackie and Dan Burne-Jones, who had acquired most of what they had from Rockwell and Sally.
And who are they?
Dan Burne-Jones was Kent's bibliographer,
Okay.
and he was the author of The Prince of Rockwell Kent, a catalog raisonné. I bought quite a number of books and ephemera from them. The bulk of the material came from that collection. But then people know that I look for things. So, for instance, there was this collector in the Chicago area that they had bought some things from Jackie Jones when Dan had dementia, when he ultimately passed, and then they were downsizing, and so I bought, I think, several prints from them, wood engravings and lithographs. Some things would come in pockets. My three strongest wood engravings came from a fellow antiques dealer who knew someone who knew the Kents, and so she had acquired it, and she sold me those as well as some ephemera. So it comes from a variety of sources, and some comes by luck. You just happen to be there at the right sale at the right time. Just
What do you mean the
digging
right
around.
sale at the right time?
Well, there was an auction, or no, it was a house sale. The guy who was running the sale knew of me, and so he contacted me and said,
Yeah.
come on down, there are a number of Kent items here, see if there's anything that you're interested in. And so I bought up the lot, in part with an institution that wanted some of that material. So they got the bulk of it, and I got some of it, and so that was a per chance, somebody giving me a call because they know who I am and what I do.
Just finally, then, he died in 71
Mm-hmm.
at around 90.
He was 88, just short of his 89th birthday.
So how is his last years, his last 20 years?
Difficult in many ways, a number of hospital visits, pacemaker, change around a couple of times, kidney stones. Actually, I might be recovering the kidney stone soon.
Wait a minute, you might actually get it in your collection?
I'm not interested in it for my collection, but it's something that should go to Plattsburgh State.
Oh my goodness.
If you're going to have the most comprehensive collection in the United States or around the world, then you need a kidney stone, right?
Yeah, no, that'll be fascinating to have a look at. Well, thank you for giving me such a comprehensive overview of Rockwell Kent,
Yeah.
right down to his kidneys.
Well, I hope now you're going to help me put away all these books and ephemera that I pulled out for you.
Yes, that's going to take a while. So thanks very much for taking the time.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Thank you for coming down.
I've been speaking with Scott Ferris, who is an American writer and historian and author of several books about Rockwell Kent here in Boonville, New York, upstate New York. Thanks again.
You're welcome. Thanks.